We are about to begin our webinar on titled State of the Ready-Made Garments Industry During the Pandemic. Is it on the way to recovery? Based on the rapid survey conducted by MaPT in Bangladesh. For Entrepreneurship Development, Brac University is really delighted to present this prescient webinar this evening. Going live from Bangladesh. We have with us distinguished discussants in the space, and we have academics as well as practitioners joining us and deliberating on the issue. I'll just go through the names of our distinguished discussants first. We have amongst us Professor Mark Einer. He is Professor of Labor and Employment Relations and Political Science and Center Director, Center for Global Workers' Rights, the Pennsylvania State University. Professor Einer has a lot of experience on researching on the ready-made garment sector of Bangladesh and labor rights issues. We have Dr. Khandakar Golam Muajjem, Research Director, Center for Policy Dialogue. We have Professor Shahidul Rahman, who is a professor of Department of Economics and Social Sciences here at Brac University. We also have chairing the session Professor Dr. Rahim B. Talukdar, advisor of Center for Entrepreneurship Development, and he is also the team leader for MaPT in Bangladesh. The keynote will be presented by Syed Hasibuddin Hussain, project manager, MaPT in Bangladesh, and MaPT in Bangladesh is essentially running this webinar. So this is a MiB webinar. I am Shamim Ehsanul Haq. I will be moderating the webinar. I am an assistant professor at Brac Business School. So without much ado, we should begin. This is one of the most prescient topics because what conclusion will be left with after this pandemic with respect to the ready-made garments industry? This question is weighing heavily on everyone's mind, and we all hope that this webinar will shed some light on that. I will now invite Professor Dr. Rahim B. Talukdar, Advisor, Center for Entrepreneurship Development, to welcome the distinguished discussants and launch the webinar. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Shamim. Welcome to this webinar, all our participants from 3 different continents. Good morning to Mark, Anna, and almost it's very late at night for Professor Shahidul Rahman, and for us it is 7 o'clock in the evening. And other participants who are there, numbering about 41. I extend my hearty welcome to you all on behalf of CED, Center for Entrepreneurship Development, Brac University, and also from the MaPT in Bangladesh project. MaPT in Bangladesh project is a 4-year project looking into the garment sector, export-oriented garment sector in the country. And there are members of we have our partners, BGMA, BKMA, and also the DIFE. Now, we all know that we are under a very stressful situation globally. All over the world, the impact of COVID-19 is being felt. It's felt similarly in Bangladesh. But what would be happening next, and how the export sector of Bangladesh will look, and how are we going to make ourselves ready for that? That is possibly the focus of this one. Is the apparel industry going to turn around, and how soon? The Commerce Minister of the government of Bangladesh very recently announced an export target, $41 billion of merchandise and $7 billion of service, making a total of 48 billion, which is a growth of about 21% that the government has projected. How it will be achieved, that is, time will only tell. Now, apparel industry contributing 82% of the total export earnings, we'll have to see that how the export earnings is going to turn around. The Export Promotion Bureau has made a projection that exports from for garments will be about 37.4 or $5 billion, which is about 13% increase. Now, given the COVID situation and the prevailing pandemic, how is the actual players, how they are? And for that reason, the MiB project has done 2 rapid surveys. One rapid survey was conducted first, and we gave a presentation on that. Now this is the second rapid survey with a total of about 3,342 factories, out of which we got a response about 70%, detail of which will be presented by the project manager of this MiB project, Mr. Sayyed Hasibuddin Hussain. I welcome you all to this. We will have a lot of discussions about how the sector is performing during this pandemic, how the factories are opening, how far they are utilizing their workers, how the workers are being trained, and how about safety. And those who are not members of BGMA, BKMA, the non-member factories, how they're performing, and what could be done for them, or what should be done for them, and what should be done for the industry as a whole to make this turnaround. We are very hopeful that the turnaround will be possible, and we will see a brighter future for Bangladesh. I welcome you all, and now over to Shamim.
Thank you very much, sir. Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for your comments and launching the seminar. As we begin, I would like to inform everyone about the format of the seminar today. What I'll be doing now is I will be inviting Mr. Syed Hasibuddin Hussain, the project manager of MAPT in Bangladesh, to first present the keynote. After the keynote is presented and we have heard him, I will invite one by one each of our distinguished discussions to actually make a commentary and provide us their views about the presentation and about the state of the ready-made garment sector based on that. Eventually, it will follow into a brief discussion among the panelists, and then we'll go for a Q&A session before closing today's seminar. So with that, I would now like to invite Syed Hasibuddin Hussain, Project Manager of MAPT in Bangladesh, Center for Entrepreneurship Development, Brac University, to present to us his keynote.
Shamim, can I take just 1 second before Hasib comes? Shamim? Shamim,
Sir,
can I take 1 second before Hasib comes?
Sure.
Yes. Well, this whole MiB project is being financed by 2 of our generous contributors, the Lotus Foundation and the Embassy of Netherlands. So I acknowledge their support and all the directions that they have been giving for us to lead this project. Okay, that was my, I'm sorry I missed it before. So thanks to the Lotus Foundation and also to our friends in the Netherlands Embassy. Okay, thank you.
I would now like to request Syed Hasibuddin Hussain, the project manager of MAPT in Bangladesh, to present the keynote. Thank you. I would also request all participants to mute their microphones so that we can have the proceedings without any noise. Thank you.
So thank you, Shamim Bhai. Thank you, all of our discussants and sir. And I especially like to thank Mark Anna. It's his birthday. So he had made time from his family to be present. So special thanks to Mark. We are mapped in Bangladesh. Our project is we are doing a census of all the export-oriented RMG factories, and we're putting it on the map. Sir also mentioned that we are generously funded by Lourdes Foundation and Embassy of Netherlands, and also by Brac. This project wouldn't have been possible without the support or the partnership with BGME and BKMEA, and also the support from DIFE. So without much ado, let me go to our project presentation. So this was a response, this particular rapid survey was a response from us to deal with the corona epidemic that was having a huge impact on the industry. And the reason we undertook this is we wanted to know the operational status of the factories. We have had a lot of news items saying what is the impact on the supply side in the order side of things, but we were not getting much of an information from the factories. And MIB has the most extensive data on the factories, so we felt it was our responsibility to respond to the challenge and tell the stories of the factory side. And then also we want to understand that the measures that the factories have taken to deal with the COVID-19, the safety measures. Also, our focus was to get the worker side of the story out to the open, not just the business side of things, the factory side of things. The workers, what changed in their life. So we wanted to also look into their story. We also felt initially we had some information about the factories or Bangladesh have a new product in the mix, like the face mask, the PPEs. So we wanted to also know what the story, inside story of that part of the industry. This was also one of the things that we promised to do, because we did a rapid survey in the beginning of May, and our plan was to repeat those surveys. So this was the second installment of the survey. But back in May, the industry was facing the turmoil more. So we wanted to see that what the situation was in the month of June. This was done in the second week of June. So methodology was that, we wanted to use our real estate, which is the detailed information of the factories. So we used our database to determine the sample. This was a census. This was not a survey that means that we did not target a particular sample, random sample. We target each and every factories that we had in the database, which is 3,342 factories were targeted among 4 major clusters or districts: Dhaka, Gazipur, Narayanganj, and Chittagong. As you know, that MIB has already published the data for Dhaka, Gazipur, and Narayanganj. Chittagong, we have not yet published. We were in the fag end of our collection of data for Chittagong when we had to turn back because of the COVID-19. So we had majority of the data, so that's why we included also Chittagong data. The things that are not part of this survey was the other area, like Mymensingh, Norsingdi, Sylhet, and Thakurga. There are small clusters of factories there. Well, Mymensingh, as a larger cluster. So those are left out because we don't have the information for those. And the survey was done with our team, the team which physically did our survey. As you know that our survey, we did census twice, once to identify the factory, which we call 3-point. So these guys are experienced with our project, with the industry. So we wanted to use that in this survey. And we used phone calls. As you know, we are helpless. We had to use the phone call. We could not visit the factories. So only through phone calls we did this survey. And the data was collected through COBO and electronic survey instrument. So let's see what we found out. So out of 3,342, 2,334 responded, which means around 70% responded. When we looked under the hood, we see that the BGMEA, 1,316 factories responded, BKMEA 395 factories responded, and both BGMA and BKMA, because there are some factories who are member of both BGMA and BKMA, 170 responded, and non-member factory, which is the strength of the Mapped in Bangladesh project, because we have looked into all parts of the industry that is dedicated for export. So non-members, which includes the subcontracting factory. So 453 such factories responded. That's the big number. So operational status. What we find out that 79% of the factories, these are only the respondents. 79% of the respondents, they're in operation, and 9% were closed, and 12% were temporary closed. So temporary closed means that they are not in operation right now, but they hope that they will be in operation in the near future. So if we look under the hood again, we see that in BGMEA, 1,048 factories were in operation, whereas 126 were permanently closed. This is sort of basing our data from MiB. And for BKMEA, 316 factories are open, whereas 26 factories closed down. And so overall, on the non-member side, the closed factory is relatively more, 44%. And in total, we find out 1,850 factories are operational. 286 were temporarily closed, which means that they're closed right now, but they hope to open. And 198 factories permanently closed down. So this is also another thing, member versus non-member comparison of factory in operation. We see that almost 81% of the factories are operational for member factories, which means that BGME and BKME, either of a member of either of this, and non-member factories 72.63% are open. So expectations of factories. One question that we asked also in our first survey and second survey, we continued that, is whether they feel that the regular operations they will be able to continue after June. So on that, they said 41% responded that they are confident that they will be in operation, and partial was 25%, and uncertain was 31%, and some factories felt that they would, 0.24% felt they would close down, and no, meaning that they felt that they would be temporarily closed. So they were not confident they will be able to continue, but they were also hopeful that maybe in the future things might have changed for them. So when we looked again under the hood about those people who, the attitude or optimism after June, this is sort of the breakdown. What we see here, that in terms of BGMEA, 50.59% of the factories, they were feeling confident that they'll be fully in operation, whereas for BKMEA, this number was 31.17. And so to complement that, 21.6% of the factories were uncertain whether they'll be in operation, and BKMA we see 40.65. And on member, the uncertainty is even more. 47.19%, and only 20% of the non-member factories were feeling that they would be able to continue, which means that even though we see a very positive number in terms of factories in operation, maybe the expectations or the optimism is not that high for them to continue in the future. And if you look at the dispersion among different clusters, we see that in Dhaka, 41% felt that they are positive. Well, in Ghazipur, the optimism was higher, 51.8%. And Narayanganj, it was the reverse. The optimism was not there. Only 17.32% factories felt that they would be able to continue in full force after June. And 50.12% were uncertain. So, it sort of complements the BKMA, BJMA data because, as you know, Narayanganj is the capital of our knitting sector. So this is another interesting slide, insight that we got. This is basically that how much capacity the factories are running. So these were the things more than 80%, 71 to 80%. So this so and so forth. What we found out that for BJMEA factories, that is the woven sector mainly, not mainly, but BJMEA factories, 33.11% were operating at more than 80%. And their member is higher also, 1,048. Whereas in BKMEA, we see that only 18.67 were working close to full capacity, more than 80%. So if we do a calculation, more than 50% capacity, what is the number? We find that in BGMEA, 80.63% of the BGMEA factories were working using more than 50% of their capacity, whereas for BKMEA, it was 58%. And for non-member, this was 53%. So we see a huge number here that 40 to 50%, just below half, is 22.8% for non-member and 21.2% for BKMA. So that's an interesting insight. So when we average the capacity of all the factories, we found out 70.55% for member factories and 60% almost for the non-member factories. So what about the workers during the pandemic? We, as you know, we collected data, MiB project. So we knew that before the COVID-19 situation, what was the number of workers working in these factories? What we find out that in Dhaka, out of the 527 factories, about 97% workers are currently employed. Whereas in Ghazipur, it's 89%, but Ghazipur factory size is larger, and also the number of workers are larger. But in there, 89% are working, and Narayanganj, 94% are working, and Chittagong, it's 92.2%. So this is the area-wise. And when we do a total, we find out that 92% workers are currently working. So the other thing that we want to look at the new kind of products, the face mask and PPE, and whether both. So what we find out that we asked them whether they're doing it for profit margin and not without profit margin. Because initially, before our first survey, we found out that there were a lot of factories who are doing it for the social cause. So we wanted to know this. So what we find out that 30% are working without profit margin still, and 61% is doing profit margin. So for profit has increased. Same thing in PPE. And for those who are working, you're making both face mask and PPE. Another thing that we also wanted to see whether they're exporting these products or they're only responding to local market demand. And what we find out that uh, positively that they are indeed exporting. 45% of those who responded that they are making this type of products. So 45% of them are making face masks, and PPE is are exporting, and 42% is, in fact, it should be 45 plus 9, 54%, or 53% rather. So 42 and 46% are doing, 42% is doing just exclusively for export, and 46 is both export. This 4% is for export and also the domestic market. So, so we see that this new product range has been included in the industry. The other thing that we wanted to know is that the measures that they're taking, safety measures for the workers. And what we find out that 98.61% of the member factories have arranged for training about COVID-19 for the workers. Whereas for non-member factories, we might have thought that it would be very, very low, but 71.3% factories have also managed to arrange training for their workers. And we also saw that for those factories who have WPC, 99% arranged for training, and those that doesn't have WPC, 79.6% have. So, so there was a significant difference. The p-value says, significant difference between these all three. So for the safety committee, surprisingly, 98.65% were making, have trained their workers, and 77.54 for those that didn't have safety committee. But you would have expected that safety committee would even topple WPC, but WPC beats safety committee in reality. But close, they're close. So in terms of, I think I've done it. So, so we asked them, we kept an open sort of question that what measures are you taking? And they came back with certain number of measures, so we tallied them. And based on our tally, what we find out that these member factories have sort of among the tally, they've taken 5 measures, and non-member is 3.42 measures. And again, WPC scores high. The number of measures that they've taken, and the factories without WPC ranks low. And same thing with safety, 5.14 and 3.61. So this is the sort of the measures that have been told by them. So body temperatures in entry for member factories, 79.68% factories had that measure, whereas non-member factories only 40.12. And disinfecting all workers, through a tunnel, this chamber. So 36% of the factories, where almost 36% of the factories have had that, whereas the non-members were 7%. That's surprising, but these are, in the non-member side, we have factories which are sister companies, really, or extension of one company. So probably they are more compliant friendly. So that's why we have this number also. So, so making the visitors go through a tunnel, 12%, and only 2.7% for non-member. Then using the trays, disinfectant tray for 55% had it, and 30.4% didn't. So the big thing was the face mask, 88.82, and for also non-member. This is also surprising because not 100% is wearing the face mask. So the other big measure that has been taken is the washing of hands with soap or sanitizer. 95.4% of the member factories are doing it, and 93% are not. So the social distancing, 3 feet distance between workers, 75% are doing it, and non-members 64 or 65% are doing it. And the providing isolation is very only 7% are doing it. So we see that reflection same for those with WPC, and so we see similar emphasis, similar trend, that face mask is 88%, washing is 95.82. So for safety also, we see that similar numbers for those factories that have safety committees. So 88.19% for face mask, and 89, surprisingly, non-member factories have more than the member factories in terms of face masks. So what are the recommendations that we see? We have felt that the non-member inclusion of non-member factory gives us a much better idea about what the industry situation is. And we believe that anybody doing research on RMG should include the non-member factories. And then we also felt that the regional disparity that we saw is also significant, which means we recommend that anybody studying the RMG should have members or samples from each region to represent it properly. And also what we feel that even though one positive is a large number of workers are there in the industry, we feel that the optimism is not there. So, which means that government needs to have policies for factories closing down. We also found a lot of factories that closed down. So this needs to be have probably a policy response to find out why these are closing, and if possible stop that from happening. And we also felt that while number of factories are there, but the utilization factor is not high. As we saw, a lot of factories are working under very bad utilization. So that needs to have a policy response, and probably research should happen why this is happening or what can improve the situation. So another thing, volatility of worker engagement. We can be very positive about 90% workers are employed, but again, the optimism, lack of optimism should raise a caution that a lot of workers might lose their job. So there should be a policy response or a leadership response for that. And the introduction of face mask and PP in the export product mix should be, this is the inclusion of new products that we are doing. So that needs to be encouraged. So that is one part that can help with the recovery. And what we find clearly, workers' participation in the decision making increases the safety measures taken. Is the possibility of safety measures taken? So the advocacy for WPC and safety committee should be strengthened. So that is one of the observations we have. We have made a separate map from this data, COVID map, because we are the map guys. We love map and we want to produce, visualize our data through a map. So let me show you how the map looks like. It's a simple map. It's sort of similar to the map that we have. So all the factories that we have data from this survey, we have them here. And similar to our map, if you go in, you can find good guys. Okay, so you see the data and what they make, what their membership is, and also we have given the countries that they're exporting to. So and the filter is a very simple filter. If you want to find out, those guys who are making these PPE product, then you can look into those factories. So thank you. That's our presentation. Thank you, everybody. Thanks to the team. We have worked very hard, and I hope it shows. Thank you.
Thank you, Sayyid Hasibuddin Hossein Bhai, for delivering the keynote speech and the presentation. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Khondokar Golam Muazzem from Center for Policy Dialogue. Dr. Khondokar Golam Muazzem is the research director of CPD. He has extensive research experience on export competitiveness, product diversification, and also had done a lot of work on global economic crisis. This certainly is a crisis. So Dr. Golam Muazzem will now be invited cordially to provide his take, his views and commentary on the presentation which we have just been through. Thank you, Dr. Golam Muazzem.
Thank you, Mr. Shamim. And I would like to congratulate MiB for undertaking this second round of survey, which actually shows how the sector is actually responding to the crisis and what's the current scenario and what sorts of initiatives are required to undertake in order to address some of the challenges that the sector is currently confronting. So thank you, Hasib Bhai. It's a very well articulated presentation, and the messages have come out very clearly. Let me actually give some of my remarks as I quite heavily involved in terms of regular developments in the ready-made garment sector nowadays in Bangladesh. So some of the perceptions and some of the realities that you have actually present here shown a very interesting dimensions, and which I think need to take into account by stakeholders. For example, it is the data indicates that the BGMEA factories are relatively better operated compared to the BKMEA ones, and over 30% of the factories are actually operating with a capacity of 80% plus. And you have mentioned that more than 80% factories of the BGMEA have a capacity utilization rate of 50% plus. So seems that relatively BGMEA factories are better situated nowadays compared to that of the BKMEA one. However, in terms of the public perception, and as the association actually gave the reaction to the government that they were rather more in difficulty compared to that of the BKMEA one. But the data shows that the BGMEA factories are relatively in a better situated compared to that of BKMEA factories one. Rather, in terms of the capacity utilization, in terms of their closure of the factories, I found that BKMEA factories are rather in a trouble position compared to that of the BGMEA one. So need to have these kinds of information to the association level as well as to the policymakers, to whom and to what level the support should go into what extent. And this also gives another important findings of you is that non-member factories are more in trouble. That we also understand why they are in trouble. But these factories are outside of the purview of government's policy response at this moment. And now the support that has been provided to the export-oriented sectors need to have the membership of either of the association. So if that is so, then it indicates that the non-member factories are not receiving any kinds of support. It would be good if your data also include that whether they received any kinds of support so far, particularly or regarding the workers' wage. And if that data presented here, that would give another interesting dimension that what sorts of support they have received so far. And that also gives an indication that how they are actually considering the level of risks that they have mentioned here, and whether that has a relationship with government's policy support or not. That could also be explored through this through the data. But what I understand here is that non-member factories are in trouble, and they need to get better support from the government. And under the current structure of the support, they are excluded. So they need to have a reformulation, and they need to have an extension and elaboration of the coverage of government policy support by covering both the members and non-member factories under this support measures that government currently providing to the ready-made garment sector. That is one. Second is that worker status. Very surprisingly, you have given a very positive impression that 96% workers are actually in work. So that is a very interesting way to look into it, that in what form they are saying that these workers are in job. There were a number of reports of laying off of the workers. There were reports of retrenchment, partial retrenchment of the workers. Did these factories have covered those who are in layoff as in operated mode of the workers? So that is an interesting thing to look at. If the 96% workers are in job, then they are in what status? Partially employed, full employed, or they are in layoff, or in what form? So that kinds of information would much more interesting at this stage. And what we also like to expect from this survey here is that if you actually share the payment of wage by the factories, and what percentage of workers are actually getting what share of the wage, like 100% wage they have received how much, or the 50%. According to the current scenario, most of the factories are providing 65% of their gross wage. So that information would be much more benefited to know about that. What is the level of wages they are currently actually receiving. So that is an important one. What we are also expecting from the survey is that the infection status. You have mentioned about the number of various kinds of measures undertaken by the factories. But did you actually ask them that whether and what percentage of workers get affected, or whether no affected workers are there? Or in indirect way, you may also ask that what percentage of workers are take on leave, or just I found a questions from Ms. Mazabin that whether the workers who were on leave, whether they receive payment or not. So these informations are of importance from these kinds of survey to understand that what is the status of the workers at this stage. What I found completely missing, and that I expect in these kinds of survey, here is that that the response of the brands and buyers. What percentage of it is strongly mentioned before immediately after the COVID, that there is lots of brands have canceled their orders, and at the same time it is also reported that a good number of brands have returned back, and they have started to take their orders. So if those informations make available here, that would make this survey more interesting, that whether factories have been affected due to not getting orders or not, or whether they have actually faced the trouble of low payment pressure or discount price or not. So these kinds of information would be much more interesting for this survey. And since there is a global initiative currently ongoing from the brand side, so brands are also expected to know that how much trouble factories are facing in terms of order cancellation, or in terms of the discount payment, or in terms of delayed or deferment of the orders. So they could also take that into account in order to reformulate their operational modalities of the global initiative that is currently ongoing under ILO, and also ongoing from European Brand Buyers Alliance. They are also actually taking those initiatives. So those informations, I think, would be interesting, and you may take those into account. But overall, I think that this is a very good initiative, and this gives some state of affairs of the ready-made garment sector, and that also helps the policymakers as well as the other stakeholders to understand the scenario and to take more specific initiatives or more targeted initiatives, what need to be done, where need to be done, and whom to be targeted and whom not. So that kinds of things can be come out from this survey. I appreciate MIB's initiative for undertaking this survey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khandekar Muazzam, sir, from Center for Entrepreneurship Development, for giving us your valuable views and commenting on the study that was conducted by MIB. Now, I have the pleasure of inviting Professor Mark Einer, Professor of Labor and Employment Relations and Center Director, Center for Global Workers' Rights in the Pennsylvania State University, to provide us his commentary and views on the presentation. Professor Mark Einer has written extensively on the global supply chain and distinguished himself by research on workers' rights and purchasing practices in the global supply chain. So, Professor Mark Einer.
Great, thank you so much for this invitation. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts and my deep appreciation for the hard work that was put into this survey and the prior survey. Someone who does surveys, I know how difficult it is to gather good information. So it's very, very impressive, the response rate that you have, the number of factories covered. In my own research, I haven't come close to this number, over 2,000 factories responding, and all the things you outlined, the range of factories, the types of factories covered. So this is an enormous contribution, and it comes at a very crucial moment. I mean, good research, it not only needs to be done well, but to have an impact has to be done in a timely fashion. So this comes at a moment where so many of us are trying to understand what's going on in the industry. And, you know, I learned a lot from reading this. A lot of questions I get about what's going on were covered by this survey, and I'll have more information now when I'm asked. For, you know, mask and personal protective equipment, I mean, if I saw the numbers right, it was probably less than 2% of factories. So there was some idea out there internationally, well, Bangladesh would be okay if they just make enough personal protective equipment. And we see that that's only a small percentage of the industry. So really my congratulations to the team for this wonderful work. Maybe just some questions and some reflections. I did have questions about workers impacted and wages and number of employment. The number seemed low to me, and I don't know why. You know, I'm not sure what's the best way to get at that information. You're the real course experts in Bangladesh. I'm just trying to understand what I can from the outside, but I do understand that if I'm not mistaken, workers who have less than 1 year of experience can be dismissed, and it doesn't, the labor laws don't apply in the same way for severance pay and others. And my sense was that when the crisis first hit, those were the first to be let go. And I wonder if they're being counted in the regular, if it's more, the more so-called permanent workers, the ones that had at least 1 year of experience. Because we were so in very, very high numbers of workers being affected. And if you just look at from BGME saying, you know, going forward, we're going to be at 55% capacity, and whatever, I know the report highlight anywhere from 3 to 4 million workers. But if you take the 4 million number and if you're at 55% capacity, a lot of workers could be affected by this. And the question about wages and so on. I wonder though, you know, is it, and you're doing other kinds of research, you know, there's sometimes you just have to get information from different sources. So having a parallel survey of workers themselves and trying to get a sense of that. I think one challenge can be when doing these kinds of surveys, if you're calling and you're trying to get someone on the phone, if a factory went under, you know, are they responding? You know, so sometimes there can be a selection issue there. The ones that are responding are the ones that are more in operation. So there's just more information to be gathered, and there's no survey is going to be able to capture all of that. What I wanted to do in the minutes I had is sort of maybe take a step back and reflect on why we're seeing some of these trends and what that might tell us of where we're going. So this question of what's going on globally for the industry and the market, as I see it, there's 3, maybe 4 phases, and I sort of outlined it in some of my work. The first was, you know, early January, February, early in the year, and I called it the raw material crisis, delays getting raw material causing disruption in the supply chain and so on in Bangladesh. The next were these abrupt order cancellations, which were measured, and that we saw, and that was really dramatic. It came in very, very harshly. Then what was mentioned was the campaign to highlight these order cancellations, the impacts they had on factory owners and on workers, and initiatives such as Pay Up, and then the reinstatement of orders as a result of that campaigning. The important thing there is a lot of those brands did not initially want to reinstate, otherwise they wouldn't have canceled. So they were pressured to do it. So the question I wonder sometimes when we're doing the survey, timing is everything. To what extent in a survey like this, are we picking up sort of the new normal during that pandemic, or are we partly picking up, to the extent we see higher rates than we might have expected, this reinstatement of orders? And there would be a rush. The factories needed those workers back in the factory after sort of on again, off again lockdowns, trying to get those orders out because there were time deadlines. So you had to get that out quickly. So the survey might be picking up the tail end of the push to get those reinstated orders out. So that would be the third phase. The first thing, in the raw material crisis. The second, the cancellation. The third, this push, this bump that comes when you try to get reinstated orders out quickly. Going forward, you know, I think like all of us, I'm concerned, and there's a bunch of reasons why. There's some elements for optimism, but one of the concerns I have is, given that some of these orders were reinstated, of course, the flip side is you have a tremendous amount of inventory. And I don't have the answer to this, but I worry that even to the extent we have reopening, and we know that I'm sitting in the US where we have a tremendous situation going on here, and the possibility, the very real possibility of closing down retail stores again. European Union did it better. There's more reopening. But the question I have there is, how much are they going to be drawing on the stockpile of inventory versus wanting new orders? Or will those orders, when they come in, fashion sensitive items, are they going to come in at a very low order volume? We might not know that for another month or so, again, as these reinstated orders get finished. So that concerns me. The element of optimism is that the extent that the European Union countries, others, Canada, New Zealand, other places, were able to reopen and start to get to extent possible business back to normal. We have to see, though, how strong that demand is. Related to that, this gets to the point, folks know my research, I'm very concerned about the pricing mechanism. When the orders come back in, not only at what volume do they come back in, but at what price point? And we're moving into a tremendous buyer's market. All these countries that went through crisis, now all these suppliers are competing with each other, and they're coming back with smaller orders, but their ability to come back at an even lower price point is going to be that much more significant. And we're going to see companies that just to stay in business and try to survive the crisis are going to come in not only breaking even, you're going to see more and more orders coming in at below cost, and that concerns me. A couple of other points though related to all this, and looking at my time here just in the last 2 minutes. The next thing I think we need to start thinking about, and it's never too early to think about it, is what do we want the future of these supply chain dynamics to look like? What lessons were learned, and how do we not return to old dynamics that were basically not sustainable in a lot of ways in terms of price squeeze and so on. I'm gonna hold on just a second, I'll close my door here. Here I think there's a couple of ideas that some of us are working on. One is this question of contracts, how order contracts are placed. What we could see, the order contracts we've seen, they've been very one-sided. The binding part is on the factory owners, not on the brands. And we think these orders should be, the binding element should go both ways. So if you place an order, you should have a binding commitment to the factory owner to produce it and ship on time, the brand to follow through on it. We've heard discussions of questions such as responsible exit. That didn't work well when the crisis hit. The idea that a buyer, you don't just abruptly terminate an order. We think those principles of binding exit should be into the contracts in a binding, the responsible exit in a binding way. There just has to be this sense of stability in the industry. I mean, as I put it, Bangladesh has been in a large part providing the clothing for the world for decades now. And we have an obligation to maintain stability and recognize that relationship. So I think this is an important part of building more sustainable supply chains of the future. I think the component of worker participation is very crucial. I like that that was so clearly included in this survey, and I think we need to build on that. We see that from research in the US when workers are involved in health and safety mechanisms, the safety is much greater at those facilities. So empowering workers at the workplace level to participate, I think, is an important step forward. I think, you know, and I'll end on this idea. I think one idea I'd like to suggest is the idea of protection of the most vulnerable, sort of the principle of the most vulnerable. Anytime there's a crisis situation, when resources are limited or resources dry up, the first ones that should be taken care of are the most vulnerable. And that these are these mostly young women, many internal migrants at the bottom of supply chains. When every money is there, and we've seen this in some cases in labor laws around the world that I've studied, if a factory goes under, the first thing you need to take care of is the worker liability. And I think we need to have a supply chain approach to that. Everyone is in crisis. Everyone can say, oh, my stock market value is down so much, my orders are down so much. But as the crisis hits, we have to take care of the most vulnerable first. Otherwise, you know, I don't know how we all survive this. As I also say, this is not a time for anyone to retreat inward. This is a global crisis. It affects all of us. We're a global society, and we have to take care of each other in these times of crisis. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Mark Anner. Thanks for your interesting ideas and the suggestions pertaining to this. We will return to Professor Mark Anner and other discussant after we have gone through the responses of all the discussants. We'll have a brief discussion then. Now, I'd like to request Professor Shahidul Rahman, Professor of Department of Economics and Social Sciences from Brac University. Dr. Rahman had done a lot of research on the ready-made garments sector of Bangladesh and worker rights. Dr. Rahman is joining us from Melbourne, Australia. So it's quite late there. So now, Dr. Rahman, if you would please provide us your points of view and your commentary. Thank you. Dr. Shahidul Rahman, can you hear me? আমরা কি ওনাকে হারায় ফেললাম নাকি?
Shyam bhai,
He's
no,
disconnected. He's
I
disconnected
think he's
somehow.
disconnected.
He's disconnected.
We
All
can-
right. So should we go to the next participant? All right. Okay. So now I have the pleasure of inviting Professor Rahim Baksh Talukdar, advisor of Center for Entrepreneurship Development, Brac University, to provide his response and commentary on the proceedings. Professor Talukdar, thank you.
Sir, we can't hear you. You need to unmute.
Okay. Well, can you hear me now? It should be. I should be audible now.
Yes,
Am
sir.
I?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you, Shamim. Well, I'll not go over the survey, but basically in terms of what Dr. Moazem and Professor Mark Anner just raised the issue. It's indeed pleasant to hear from them, appreciating our effort, but definitely there are always opportunities and scope. Meanwhile, I have seen some of the questions raised by some of our learned participants who are not discussants immediately, but they will be coming in this. The questions of workers, whether in terms of the 96% participation, now, how do you define it? That is, we have not gone into that. It has been left open to the particular factory. Whether, as Mark pointed out, that if it is less than 1 year, they will be clearly laid off, or as Dr. Moazem also mentioned, that is it that what type? Are they partially employed, fully employed, or are they laid off for some time? And then the factories, if they go for permanent closure, then only they will be entirely gone, remove them. So it's a question in terms of further investigation. I definitely appreciate it. And also the question has been raised in terms of asking the workers that they are aware about the hand washing and etc. But not the infection rate. So there is a question that has not been asked more or less deliberately, because people are not very keen to make observations about their illness and to say that, well, how much who has been infected and who has not been infected. They assume that those who come to the factory, they are not immediately infected, but if they are infected, they will possibly be at home. Well, Mark, and definitely you have raised the bigger issue, the global horizon. And in terms of the global picture that you said, in terms of the four phases, we understand that it came as a shock to the globe, and definitely the initial crisis in terms of obtaining raw materials, and subsequently in terms of order cancellation. And order cancellation became very, very significant for Bangladesh, because over $3 billion worth of orders were cancelled. Now, as they are coming back, which issue Dr. Moazem also raised, that as the brands, what is the response of the brands that he also mentioned. So maybe subsequently we'll try to see that which brands are coming and which brands are giving supports to our workers under what conditions. Of course, in terms of the pricing policy, as Mark has pointed out, it's always that the buyers have the privilege in this kind of situation, and we being a little less developed country where our negotiating capacity is possibly a little limited. So the future, as you have mentioned, Mark, in terms of the global supply chain, that we will have to very closely look in terms of the contracts between our producers and sellers, whether there will be contractual agreements in terms of liabilities, in terms of how exits can take place. And of course, in terms of how the workers should participate more. So our effort was only to see the current affairs. There are certain limitations, I understand, and gradually we'll try to see that these are further investigated. But the sector as a whole is gaining momentum, as I personally feel that it is gaining momentum, and we should dare to positively look to their performance. And whether the more than 50% capacity utilization, but then as Hasib has pointed out, that there are factories in BKME particularly and in non-member groups where the capacity utilization is real low, and how to help them. That is possibly we would like to have hear from our discussants and also from our other participants, how to help them and how to bring them into the fold, and see that we are definitely on the same track so that we can achieve the success that we have projected, about $37 billion worth of apparel for 2021. Okay, I see Shahidur Rahman is back, so welcome, Shahid, and over to Shamim.
Thank you, sir, for your valuable comments. Now I will invite Dr. Shahidul Rahman, Professor of Economics and Social Sciences here at Brac University. Dr. Shahid got disconnected, but now he is back online. Dr. Shahidul Rahman, if you would please provide your valuable commentaries and views on today's proceedings. Thank you. Dr. Shahidul Rahman from Melbourne.
Thank you. Thank you. First, I'd like to thank CED for inviting me as a discussant. And I also like to congratulate CED for doing their second study, considering the lockdown situation of the country. So far, to my knowledge, only 4 research reports based on primary data are available on the impact of the COVID-19 on the Bangladesh RMG. First, we got Mark Anna's Abundant, then BIGD's the role of trade union, and then we have CED's 2 study, phase 1 and phase 2. Now, the second study, from my understanding, like the data shows some kind of inspiration for the industry. You know that the first study of the CED, and in that study, the data was collected and for first week of May. So if I go to the do some comparison of these 2 studies, there is some inspiration here, such as in phase 1, 64% factories actually were in operation, but in this phase 2, 80% factories are in operation. And also 27% of the factories were found to be currently utilizing more than 80% of the total capacity, while the earlier study, it shows 8% factories had more than 80% capacity. Also, there's inspiration from the point of view worker participation. Already Muazzem Bhai and also mentioned that the factories who are currently operational are using 92% of their workforce during the pandemic as compared to the pre-pandemic period. So, but in the first study of CED, the figure was 57%. But I see there are some ways CED could improve this study, maybe looking some kind of further insight. For example, their phase 1 survey shows that 43% factories expected to resume full operation after June. But the second study, it shows that 40% factories expected to resume full operation after June. So we see some kind of downturn here, like 3% less here. So if we could get some information on that, like why it happened, although the capacity increased in phase 2 study, but still 40% factories resume operation in full scale. Also, we know that after the Rana Plaza, the Labor Amendment 2013, it made compulsory for the use of safety committee in the factory, and also after that WPC become much more functional. So this study also shows that how having the factories have been benefited by having a WPC and a functional safety committee in the factories. However, I think they could also do another thing, like make some comparison between factories unionized and factories non-unionized factories. What's the situation there between the unionized and non-unionized factories? Because we are focusing more on the WPC, but what about the factories under unionized and non-unionized? Then also we could get more information on the status of order from buyers, like Mark Anner did the study back getting the data from March. So after 4 months, actually what's the status of the order from the buyers. So here, if they could include this information, what the suppliers think about the status of the orders and the payment. And another point that I would like to address here, like the BIGD study that conducted in May, it was based on the trade union leaders. And from that study, it reveals that there's some question about getting the access of the government stimulus package. We know the government has designed a package mainly for the workers' wage. But in this study, the CED could do one thing, that they could find some data on that, how many factories received a stimulus package from the government and what is their experience. Because so far the media report shows that about 1,800 factories received 3 months salary from the government. And the BIGD study argues that the amount that the government designed for the workers' wage, actually it's not sufficient to cover all the workers of the export-oriented factories. So here, if we get some data on that, like what the suppliers think about their access to those to the government fund, and what mainly if they could some kind of comparison, like large factories, medium factories, and small factories, about the access to the government stimulus package, not only such as government stimulus package, but also other resources if available. So here, then we can find that actually factories who really need those funding, are they getting that funding? And apart from this study, I'd like to address one area that is totally missing in our in our discussion. That is, like back in 2009, the Bangladesh government developed a national council on industrial health and safety. Later, this council in 2013, after Rana Plaza, they introduced occupation safety and health policy 2013. So we have the OSH policy for applicable for the industry. But the problem is, after the introduction of the OSH policy, the government also formed the National OSH Committee. But we do not have a national plan of action on OSH. So we have the OSH policy, and this OSH policy clearly states that the factories have obligation to identify the health-related risk in the factory, and also they have to make sure how to solve those health-related risks and make an appointment of the expert on this field. We have those in our OSH policy, but the problem for the practitioner that because of the absence of the national plan of action of occupational safety and health, we can't actually execute that policy. So what I'm suggesting, that this is the right time for us to reform our OSH policy 2013, aligned with the COVID-19 situation. And also, at the same time, we have to work to develop a national. So far, I remember that the ILO in 2017, they made an effort to prepare a national plan of action on OSH for the country, but somehow it lost the momentum. So again, if we have that the National OSH Committee, and also we have that document of a plan of action, because that document will exactly tell us who is responsible for what aspect of the OSH, and when they have to deliver the services, to whom they have to deliver the services, what is the . committee at the factory level would coordinate with the National OSH committee and how to monitor, how to administer this OSH. So since we do not have that national plan of action on OSH, so we actually can't execute it in a professional and a systematic way. So that's why I think it's the high time for us to think to reform our OSH policy and also develop a national plan of action on OSH. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shahidul Rahman. Thanks for your valuable commentaries, especially the comments on the WASH policy and other issues. Now, what we'll do is we'll go for a very brief panel discussions. I'll perhaps ask some general questions to which you can, any of you can take the question, or you can jointly answer those questions or comment on those, and then we'll go to the Q&A session. What I can see is that we have many questions that have been asked. So some of these questions will be fielded to you so that you can answer. So for maybe the next 10 minutes, we can have a general discussion, and the panelists, as part of the panelists, you can answer those questions. So the first question or commentary from the proceedings is that, what do you think are the key areas of vulnerability in the wake of the COVID-19 situation, which needs to be addressed in the ready-made garment sector? Key areas of vulnerability which can actually hinder the recovery. All right. The title of the seminar is it on the way to recovery? So what are those vulnerable areas? Thank you.
Shamim, are you making it an open question answer for anybody, or are you targeting anyone particular to respond?
Well, just the panelists. Just the panelists. You can respond, sir. It's for the panelists who are still present. Syed Hasibuddin Hussain, Dr. Mark Annar, and Dr. Shahidul Rahman. The questions can be taken by 4 of you. Yes. Dr. Mark Annar, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Right. So the issue was, what are the most vulnerable issues in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis that may hinder the recovery of the RMG sector? Thanks.
Do you want me to start then with some ideas?
Yeah, you can start if you want.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you could go from really big picture all the way down to, like I mentioned, the women workers at the bottom who are the most vulnerable. But I'll start with the big picture. Again, we don't know what's going to happen to the market going forward. There's so much uncertainty. So we don't know to what extent there will be continued reopening or a close down here in the US. And we're going through a crisis at a time when we thought the virus would be way down, anticipating a surge in October, November. So if we end up in a complete shutdown again, we might be in a period where the garments that are sold are largely stockpiled inventory, and then we go into another shutdown again. So the real vulnerability there is demand, order volume. Linked to that is, on the buyer side, there are going to be winners and losers, and there already are. We see a whole slew on one side, they're entering into bankruptcy and some going straight out of business. And we see others whose market share has gone through the roof. And in a rough distinction between the two, the ones that did well were the ones that stayed open during the crisis. So you start with online sales, and we know who the big companies are there. But other stores in the US that were deemed essential businesses because they sold food, but those stores also sold garments. So you have like Target and Walmart, they stayed open. So there's a reshuffling. We don't know at the end of the day, does that greater buyer consolidation then lead to greater power imbalances down the supply chain? That's on the buyer side. On the other side, as I mentioned earlier, the other vulnerability is the huge number of suppliers and countries that are, sorry to put it like this, a bit desperate now to get new orders. So they're all in competition with each other. So that's the other question of the vulnerability. Linked to it, there is discussions about, well, what do the new supply chains look like? And once again, we hear two things that have been in discussion for quite some time over the last decade: nearshoring or onshoring, and automation. So now the discussion is coming up, wow, this was, what a disruption this was, and so on. And does this now mean going forward, as we rebuild or build a new supply chains, that we need to automate more and bring production back home? As I was saying, I don't know the quest back home for the main purchasing countries. Obviously, there's a lot of consumption in developing countries. China's market is growing. I would, for bringing it back, it doesn't, there's sometimes I think it's unfair to suggest that just because you bring it to Europe or you bring it to the US, you solve different issues about compliance. We have cases north of London. Last year, we have cases in Los Angeles with considerable worker rights violations. So that's not, if we think of it as a solution, there are problems there. The problem is wherever you produce, whether it's in Los Angeles or in Bangladesh, there are price pressures, and that creates, in some cases, incentives for violations, and that's what needs to be addressed. And then the vulnerabilities, and it's come up, I see in the chat, female workers who are the majority, pregnant women workers who are very vulnerable, and efforts to avoid paying maternity pay and so on. As I started off by saying, we need to turn around our principles and who we protect first when a crisis hits, and it has to be with the most vulnerable. If you got a choice between someone who had a problem with stock market valuations and someone who has trouble putting food on the table, to me the priority is clear. It's the person that is facing a question of food insecurity. We have to prioritize that first. So those are my answers about the vulnerability. The question that's also coming up, and I'll just take a minute to touch on this. So what do we do? Like, how do you empower manufacturers and workers to address this? As I keep saying, I see a marked power imbalances in these supply chains. The question is, how do you address that? And as a political scientist as well, we talk a lot about a collective action problem. The smaller suppliers and dispersed workers are very weak because they don't bargain as a block. So the answer to it is greater communication and coordination of demands. And it's easier said than done, because you've got suppliers who are in competition with each other, but the need is to speak with one voice, and not just Bangladesh, with all major suppliers. And that's why initial initiatives coming out of the STAR network that includes China and Vietnam and Pakistan, Myanmar, along with Bangladesh, I thought were very important steps. If you want to do that coordinated bargaining in an effective way, I see there's a question of economic power, there's a question of normative power, which is the right ethics and principles. And the only way to do that in a way that's going to be powerful is if it's done in coordination with the full participation of workers. So if workers are there stating their needs for health and safety, wages, living conditions, stability of contracts, in coordination with suppliers, that presents a very powerful way to address some of these squeezes in supply chain and rectify them.
Dr. Mark Ennard, thank you very much for your response. This was really a very detailed analysis, and it actually touches on what you mentioned earlier about making those contracts binding to the brands, and making sure that the price point at which the orders return is actually sustainable price points, and not price points which are exploiting the labor and that sort of thing. So it's a very interesting insight. Is there any additional comments to Dr. Mark Ennard's comments? Any complementary comments anyone wants to make? Professor Shahidul Rahman or Hasibuddin Hussein Bhai? No?
I
Well,
just want. Oh,
go ahead, Shah.
okay, Asif bhai. I just want to add one thing. Like, yeah, actually, it's an old story, but still we are facing that old story. Like, in the supply chain, if you look at the supply chain, we have the suppliers, then we have the workers, but then on the top there's the buyers. But end of the day, the most vulnerable among these different actors, the workers are the most vulnerable. I mean, they were vulnerable before, they're still vulnerable, and their vulnerability, their level of vulnerability is just going worse under this pandemic. Like, if you look at the buyers, they have the luxury to use the force measure to violate the contract. Then if you look at the suppliers, again, they can look at the Bangladesh Labor Act using section 12, 16 and 20 to get advantage and to lay off the workers. But actually, what's happened for the workers? And even if you look at the level of unionization in our country, it's still less than 10%. So so end of the day, actually they don't have choice for a country like Bangladesh. Like, I mean, still we are saying this for the last 20 years. Like, these are the women workers who did not have, actually who do not have any alternative job in this country. So where they will go? They must go to the factory to save their jobs. And whatever the condition is a pandemic, they don't care. They have to survive. So that's the question for a country like Bangladesh. Like, it's not about just taking preventive measures from for COVID-19, but it's most about survive during this pandemic, to get rid of the starvation and get their jobs.
If I can add,
Thank
I think what Mark was saying, the big risk is the huge stockpile. So typically in July, we would be making stuff for the winter season. So if in the state side, if the situation gets worse and there is a lockdown, then there's going to be a huge decline on that. So whatever we talk about, if there is no order, the industry will shrink. That's a reality. Uh, no measures, nothing can save it. One thing that our research points to do, which needs to be investigated, is how come with 90% capacity, the optimism is so low? It might mean what Mark you were saying, that the orders, the pressure that was built up, maybe they're doing those orders. When it dries up, it's not really driven by a demand. Maybe on the Europe side, there is a demand. Okay, fine. Maybe Walmart and the internet players, they're driving some demand. But what if this demand is a false demand based on the pressure, of the stockpiles that now they're doing? So when it dries up, there's no work. If there's no work, we will not be able to sustain this factory. The workers, I mean, if there's no work, there's no factory, there's no thing. So that's one. And number two, as you know, there's a soft loan that was given to these factories, right? And who got these soft loans? Those who needed most, or those who were more powerful politically? We don't know. But whatever the case, there's a period after which the factories will need to pay up. So their cost of capital will rise. They will have to pay up. This is a soft loan, but they will have to pay up. So that money they need to source that money. So if that hits with the demand slot, then it's a double whammy for the factory, right? And the bank will not be able to sustain them. So, so that is another big challenge. So I think the lack of optimism that came up from this study needs to be seriously investigated very soon, very quickly.
Thank you, Syed Hasibuddin Hussain Bhai and Dr. Shahidur Rahman. This will be my last question for the panel to handle, and that has to do with product diversification. Although we don't see that much, but still the discussion broached the issue of factories shifting to manufacturing of PPE and other protective gear. But the size of the industry is huge, and whether this can indeed help them recover for in the medium term or short term, that is the question. Does that help, or is there any possibility that the product diversification or things like that can help it recover?
For anybody that question, or because yeah, please, you can, but yeah, I think it's, you could.
Mark, your observation from our report was that the number of factories working for these products are not huge. So that just simple question is, we have to find out the size of it. If it's a significant size, yes. But then again, when you are making masks, I don't, the labor requirement is very, 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 very low. If it's a, it's a totally automated system. If it's a, reusable mask, then it's a little bit higher. So it depends on what is the demand for it and how many factories really gets to address that demand. So if it's significant, if it grows, yes. If it doesn't, but I'm sure that the local demand is also very high. Bangladesh is a large market.
Any additional or complementary comments by any of the panelists? Thank you.
No, just to reiterate, I enjoyed being a part of this. I think this is an enormous contribution, this research project, and I think we just have to keep doing more research and collaborating. This is an evolving situation. It's very, very dynamic. So we have to just constantly stay on top of it and contribute with the research we can, and keep these conversations going. Listen, thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we'll move to the question and answer session. We have quite a few questions. So I will just take 1 minute maybe to look at these questions and field it to you. Maybe the floor can be opened so that anyone can ask a question vocally, I suppose. Zabir Bhai, can you please help?
If anyone, he or she can raise his hand so that we can make him.
I already have a few questions on my Q&A panel. Maybe we can ask them, right? Smita Nimilita.
Hello.
Thank you. Ms. Jennifer Jabbar, please. You can ask your question.
I had a question to Mark. Do you, so one thing that came to my mind, that there could be a consolidation of supply base as the brands re-strategize. Do you think that there, in the re-strategization policy, that product categories would vary, and would Bangladesh would it be more inwoven or knit? Is this something that what is selling right now? Is it something where you're seeing, say, probably a lot of T-shirts are being sold, or is it sleepwear being sold, or is it PP? Does Bangladesh need to adapt to certain categories to maintain market share? So what are your takes on that? Because that would be the actual question of whether factories adapt and sustain in capacities. Thank you.
Just answer as they come in like that.
What are your thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Okay, sure. So that is the crucial question. The data are just starting to come in. It's frustrating. Those of us who do research, looking at trade data, it always is a 2-month lag, and it just makes such a difference. And by the time we get the data, so I'm looking at the US data, it's already outdated because that's the point of entry to the US, which it was what was being produced a month earlier. So I don't have, unfortunately, right now. I will soon. We can disaggregate, like you're saying. I don't have that breakdown at this time. We see a generalized decline. If you look at imports to the U.S. From around the world in garments, monthly by month, April came in as being the lowest point since 1997 in 23 years. That's how big the drop was. So it's changing very, very quickly. They say now this last month in the US side, retail was up 105%. So there was some pent up demand. Again, we don't know what's being sold is stockpiled. It's easier to stockpile fashion basics, like t-shirts and things like that. So you could just, there's all these discussion. Where does it get stockpiled? Does it stay in the factory? Does it get stockpiled in warehoused in Bangladesh? And the cost is on the factory owner to do it. Does it get sent to the US and get warehoused here? I think it would be very risky because we're right in the middle of the crisis to try to predict what would be the way to go. If you're shifting, if you don't already do a mix of knit and woven and you're going from one to the other, I mean, there's cost involved. I'm not an expert in that engine, that kind of that level, but the machinery you use and so on. So I would just say it's very risky to predict. The dust is not going to settle, as we say. We're not going to really know the trends probably for at least another 6 months. And there's so many other unknowns. One is who's consolidating, who's not consolidating. Meanwhile, what's going on in Asia is a moving target. I mean, as you know, production started leaving China. It started going back into China because China, the virus hit first, and we know they came down with very tough measures, and they were back online first. So it's sort of, some of it moved back into China, but the longer term trend is that's going to continue long term move out of China, and there's an opportunity there for Bangladesh to pick up a lot of those orders. I don't see that scale of volume going onshore or into automation. That's another way to look at. One is what the buyers are doing. Another is what types of products is China slowly no longer doing, and there's space to pick up the share that China had.
Okay, Ms. Zaima Islam.
Hello, this is Zaima from the Daily Star. I was interested in how you found out how many of the workers were still employed in the factories. And my reason for questioning is that because we do hear reports of workers being laid off. There are protests on the streets, and we do know that that factories are retrenching a lot of the workers. So I'm trying to understand I'm trying to, I guess, reconcile some of the statistics with what we're hearing on the ground.
So I'll take that. One thing is, like, if you look at our data set, we report worker numbers by gender for our map data. So we have experience in collecting this data. So this time around, when we used a phone call we have data about the exact contact, who to contact, who gave us the data first time. So we have sort of a relationship. They know who we are. So we approach that person and we get the data from them, that how many workers are working. So that's the source from the factory. Does that answer your question?
I was saying, does it take into account workers being retrenched? Is this data reflective of workers being retrenched, not laid off, just retrenched?
No, the basic data is how many workers are there in your factory right now.
I just want to add here, Asif bhai, if you permit. Like recently, I found that the Department of Inspection for Factories and Establishment, the DIFE, that they actually took an initiative to get the number of the workers who actually lost their jobs, who were fired from the factories. So according to the DIFE calculation, around about 25,000 workers lost their jobs. So, and but we are not sure about the methodology that DIFE used to get that number. But it says that the trade union leaders, they also extended their cooperation to DIFE to get that number. But around they came up with a number that 25,000 workers lost their jobs.
Okay, I mean, we haven't done the calculation. If you notice that there are a number of factories, we found out that they closed down. So I'm sure that in DIFE's calculation, those were included. So I have to compare the data to really make a conclusion. But I have come across other small researches that has happened, which also about a month back, and which also pointed to high worker participation. You know, about workers' diary. You know, they were also coming up with a monthly thing. So that also had a very high data. So we'll have to compare what you said, that DIFE data, and what is really happening.
Thank you, Hasib Bhai. Thank you for your responses. We can take a few questions, maybe two more questions from the Q&A panel that we have. There is a question to address to Dr. Mark Annar by Kamrul Shubho. Dr. Annar, can you read that question? You have a Q&A panel.
Yeah, let me open it up.
Right. So, yeah, it says Kamrul Shubho. My question is to Dr. Annar. That's how it begins.
Yeah. So how do you think these yeah, this is the one, order cancellations, factory going under, not paying salary, would affect the low-income women in supply chains? Do you think women workers would suffer more than male workers? If so, what can be done for them? I mean, this is a crucial question, and I think Brac has another project of worker diaries, and this is documented very carefully. So if someone maybe could speak to that on the panel. I mean, you do see this disparity in how this is more adversely affecting women workers in terms of, we know this, I know this from my own research, the wages to start with are lower for women workers, and they've been more adversely affected. And when I say they're most vulnerable, that also includes employment status. So the ones that might have less than 1 year experience, or might not have more permanent contracts. We also see, and I know this more from my research in India, women workers, when I think of the very bottom tiers of the supply chain, you get into homework, and those are overwhelmingly women workers. And I've been in discussions, so I don't know if someone there knows the situation for homework in Bangladesh. In India, those many of those women, all those orders just dried up very quickly, and they're suffering as a result. One element to this that I think is important to remember, it's sort of stating the obvious. This is not just a crisis for one sector, garments. This is a global crisis that's affecting all sectors of the economy. So I was always struck in some of the research I had done by the importance of family remittances in the case of Bangladesh. Far more money comes into Bangladesh in remittances than is generated in salaries for garment workers. It's like 2.5 times more. It's the remittance value than wage value. And there's a significant number of garment workers who made ends meet every month because they also, in addition to their wages, they they got some money from remittances. But that money is drying up because a lot of the workers that are elsewhere, whether it's in construction or service sector, they're losing their jobs. So, and a lot of workers, other family members that worked and brought an income, whether it was a spouse or somebody else in the household. So I refer to a triple squeeze on workers, the loss in some cases of salary. Now the loss of salary might be just be straight out dismissed, but it could be what we're talking about if you're laid off and you're getting 65%. So you have a reduction what you normally would have gotten. But families are also losing that extra money that might have come in from remittances. They're losing the money that might have come in from another member of the household working. So this is, I think, it's just, I can only imagine. I studying this from a distance, but the crisis that these workers must be facing, this really is a matter of survival, and their needs need to be prioritized. For the factories, for the brands, for the governments, for the international community, women undoubtedly are being the most adversely affected.
Thank you, Dr. Mark Annar. Miss Laura Gutierrez, do you have a question? You can ask that question. Miss Laura Gutierrez.
Yeah, I was just going to be, I was asking about the employment status of the workers employed at the factories that are not working at full capacity. I think some of you did answer this to a certain extent with Zyma's question, but I was just wondering if at those factories that are not working at full capacity, did those factories provide you with information about the change of employment status to their workforce? For instance, are they laid off or are they terminated permanently? Is that information that you did collect?
No, not.
Asif Bhai. Yes.
We did not collect it. We did not collect that data.
Got it. Thank you.
But I believe the data that shows is sort of the at the time of we asked the question, how many workers were there working? Because as you know that in a typical Bangladeshi apparel factory, every day there are some hires and some people leave. It's sort of a continuous process. So the worker number is never a constant, even between 2 days. It's not a constant. So so that's why typically this answer to this question is how many workers are really working on that particular day.
Got it. So thanks. And if you allow me, can I ask one more question? Could you just share briefly what the next steps are in terms of your surveying? Will there be will you do a similar survey in a matter of months on this with the same questions?
Yes, that is part of the plan. We will continue to do this survey.
Great.
And probably add questions. That's just bad habit on our part.
Thank you.
So I think we have, if there are any more questions, we can maybe take one more question. It's almost 9 p.m. So maybe one last question for the panelists. I see quite a few attendees still there. So if you would like to ask one last question, you're welcome. Thank you. There is a question by Ms. Sultana Begum. I suppose. All right. If there are no more questions, then I think we can conclude. I would like to invite Professor Rahim Talukdar to conclude today's webinar and thank the panelists for their valuable time. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Showing. Well, it's very unfortunate that most of the Q&A session I missed. My computer went wild. My laptop went wild and I missed a lot of the questions that has been raised. But I must thank all the parties, discussants from 3 continents and our valued participants from different parts of the world. Well, I heard the last one that what will be your next step. The CED, for that matter, the MIB is going to continue with this effort to find out what is the status of the industry and ultimately see that the issues that have been raised by our discussants and participants, these we are addressing in some form or the other. All the questions that are there, and to quote Mark, as uncertainty is always there. So the uncertainty, within this uncertain world we will have to live. Whether COVID, there will be another surge that will affect all over 200 countries in the world, and in what degree, we have to watch and continuously observe how things progress. Let's hope that the whole world the world as a whole can overcome this pandemic, and it's only the creator knows what is next. But let's all keep our fingers crossed and see that we can survive. If we look to the last 100 years, there have been disasters of different kinds, and different kinds of disasters people have survived. Of course, there have been deaths in millions, natural and man-made, I would say. But in any case, this COVID is now it's the global, and we hope that Bangladesh will fight and ultimately will be able to achieve what we want to do. I must thank all our discussants, participants, and particularly Shamim, who has taken the trouble of moderating this session, and my colleagues at CED, MIB, all the participants and all our discussants, and at the same time, once again, those who have put money for all of these activities, this Lawrence Foundation and the Embassy of Netherlands. My colleagues at CED and MIB, hats off to you for all the trouble that you have taken, and it is indeed we are happy that a lot of participants, over 40, could join us and give us insights. Once again, thank you very much, and hope everyone will be safe and sound.
Thank you very much, sir, for your closing comments. This is still a very complex situation that is developing globally, and we don't see things easing anytime soon. So with that note, from Center for Entrepreneurship Development and on behalf of MIB, I would like to thank and say goodbye to all the participants, and especially give kudos to the our partners, Laudes Foundation, Kingdom of Netherlands, BGME and BKMEA, Bangladesh Garments Manufacturers and Exporters Association, and Bangladesh Knitwear Manufacturers and Exporters Association, who are the strategic partners with CED. Thank you all. Thanks to all the participants from United States, Australia, and also from, of course, from Bangladesh locally who are attending, and of course our attendees. Good night.
Good night.
Thanks, Mark.
Okay.